Have you ever had the feeling you're doing everything right? Praying, seeking God, working faithfully, keeping your commitments. But something invisible seems to be preventing the blessings you're expecting from finally manifesting? Like there's a transparent ceiling between you and the next level, and no matter how hard you try, you can't identify what's blocking. Most people search for the cause within themselves: lack of faith, unconfessed sin, insufficient discipline. But what if the answer is beside you, not inside you? There's a truth most people don't want to hear because it involves pain, loss, and difficult decisions. Some of the people closest to you may be being used, consciously or unconsciously, as spiritual obstacles between you and what God has prepared. Not necessarily from malice, not necessarily from intention, but with an effect as real and as measurable as any direct spiritual attack. And the lack of discernment to identify this pattern has been costing purposes, delaying blessings, and keeping people trapped in cycles God had already prepared the exit from long ago. What you're about to discover will give you 8 specific signs God uses to indicate a removal is being promoted by Him, not to make you cold or isolated, but to position you where the promised blessings finally have space to arrive. Stay until the end, because the last sign is perhaps the most comforting of all, and will completely change how you interpret certain exits that already happened in your life that you still haven't fully understood. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 14 verse 33 that God is not author of confusion, but of peace. And this simple statement carries one of the most practical discernment tools existing for evaluating relationships. If there's a specific person whose presence in your life consistently generates confusion, emotional instability, and absence of peace, not occasionally, not in difficult phases, but as constant pattern, this isn't relational coincidence, and it's also not necessarily your fault. It may be a divine removal sign you haven't yet learned to read. The peace the Holy Spirit produces isn't the artificial peace of those avoiding conflict at any cost. It's a deep and stable peace persisting even in the middle of difficult circumstances. When this peace consistently disappears in a certain person's presence, when you feel tense before even meeting them and relieved right after they leave, your spirit is registering something your mind is still trying to rationalize. Spiritual discernment operates at this subtle frequency long before logic constructs a convincing argument. The difficulty of naming this pattern as removal sign comes from confusion between loyalty and obedience. Many people confuse maintaining a relationship-stealing peace with being faithful, committed, or spiritually mature. But there's huge difference between persevering in a difficult relationship that's growing and persevering in a toxic relationship that's destroying. Genuine growth has moments of tension, but tension serves growth, not chaos. When tension only serves chaos, discernment needs to evaluate whether it's growth or imprisonment. The practice of evaluating peace's presence in your relationships begins with honest observation without judgment. After spending time with a certain person, do you feel closer to God or more distant? Clearer or more confused? Lighter or more burdened? These questions aren't an invitation to abandon all difficult relationships. They're discernment tools to identify where peace's absence is sign and not circumstance. And speaking of weight, there's a specific sensation toxic relationships produce going beyond confusion and needing to be named clearly. Jesus made an invitation in Matthew 11 verses 28 to 30 precisely defining the pattern of how God's relationships should feel. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. The yoke Jesus offers is light, and relationships God places in your life reflect this lightness. Doesn't mean absence of challenge, doesn't mean there'll never be conflict, but means the relationship overall builds, strengthens, and draws closer to God instead of draining, weakening, and distancing. There's concrete difference between tiredness coming from investing in a relationship that's growing which is temporary, has direction, and produces fruit, and tiredness coming from toxic relationships draining without growing. The first has the quality of tiredness after a good workout. You're exhausted, but feel something was built. The second has the quality of tiredness after a sleepless night. You're exhausted and nothing was produced. When you recognize this second type of tiredness as consistent pattern in a specific relationship, discernment is showing you something affection still doesn't want to see. The spiritual growth God has for you doesn't happen in vacuum. It happens in community, in relationships, and in context of people walking in the same direction. Therefore, relationships distancing from God instead of drawing closer aren't neutral. They're active obstacles to the purpose God is developing in you. The divine protection operating through certain people's removal isn't cruelty. It's care from a father knowing the weight you're carrying is consuming energy that should be being directed to something else. The practice of identifying weight in your relationships begins with honest review. Which people in your life consistently leave you more tired than when you arrived, farther from God than before conversation, and more confused about your purpose than when you were alone? This list isn't final verdict. It's starting point for prayer and discernment. Letting go doesn't need to happen all at once or dramatically. It can start with gradual reduction of access and investment while you seek God's confirmation about the next step. And beyond confusion and weight, there's an even more subtle language your spirit uses to warn you about who shouldn't be so close. There's a language operating below logic's level that most people learn to ignore because they can't explain it in rational conversation. The language of human spirit responding to spiritual environment around. When you're near a certain person and feel restlessness having no identifiable objective cause. When something inside seems to be on alert without there being logical reason for it. When you can't completely relax in someone's presence despite having no concrete evidence anything's wrong. This isn't necessarily social anxiety or personal insecurity. It may be the Holy Spirit exercising active protection over you. Spiritual discernment frequently operates at this subtle frequency, not as audible voice or dramatic vision, but as internal knowing arriving before logic has time to construct an argument. The Bible describes the Holy Spirit as the one guiding into all truth, and this guidance isn't limited to theological truths. It includes relational truths, truths about environments, and truths about people your mind hasn't fully processed yet, but your spirit already evaluated. Learning to trust this discernment without needing to justify it to everyone around is one of the most advanced exercises of spiritual maturity. The difficulty of hearing this spiritual restlessness is in cultural and religious pressure to always have an objective reason for relational decisions. Why are you distancing from this person? Is a question culture expects to have an answer in list of provable facts. And when the honest answer is, my spirit doesn't find peace near them, and the Holy Spirit seems to be alerting me, this is rarely accepted as sufficient. But spiritual growth includes learning to trust what God speaks internally, even when you can't translate it into externally acceptable language. The practice of developing sensitivity to this spiritual restlessness begins with stopping automatically rationalizing what you feel in certain people's presence. Next time you feel this inexplicable restlessness, instead of trying to find the logical cause immediately, stop and pray. Lord, what is my spirit picking up here that my mind hasn't seen yet? This type of prayer develops the communication channel between you and the Holy Spirit in an area most people never learn to cultivate. And beyond this internal restlessness, there's very concrete external evidence a relationship is blocking what God has for you, and it appears in a very specific place in your life. There's a very precise spiritual indicator a relationship is operating as obstacle instead of as ally, and it appears in your prayer life's quality. When you notice since a certain person entered or gained more space in your life, your prayer became more superficial, shorter, or harder to maintain. This isn't scheduled coincidence and isn't normal spiritual phase. It's a pattern discernment needs to seriously evaluate, because prayer is the most honest thermometer of spiritual health, and when it cools without apparent reason, it's time to look at what changed around. The focus on purpose God placed in you requires an amount of energy, attention, and intention simply not left over when you're constantly managing dramas, demands, and dynamics of toxic relationships. Spiritual warfare uses people strategically, not always consciously on their part, but efficiently on the enemy's part, to occupy mental and emotional space that should be available for calling. When focus is lost and spiritual fire diminishes, the question isn't just what's happening to me, but also with whom am I spending most of my time and energy. The redirection God promotes sometimes begins exactly with this diagnosis. Identifying distraction isn't personal weakness, but external attack operating through relationships consuming without building. Abraham couldn't have received the complete vision of what God had for him while Lot was present. The separation seeming like loss was what opened his eyes to see the entire land. Some relationships aren't declared enemies. They're simply incompatible with the focus level your purpose requires, and God promotes removal exactly to create the space purpose needs to breathe. The concrete practice here is making honest mapping of where your mental and emotional energy goes during the week. Which relationships occupy the greatest space in your thoughts, worries, and conversations, and whether this space is being used for growth or for perpetual crisis management. If the answer is crisis management, discernment is being invited to act. And speaking of things seeming like crisis, but actually being divine redirection, there's one of spiritual life's most misunderstood experiences needing to be reframed, the one most people call rejection. There's a pain no other pain can completely imitate, the pain of rejection. Whether in a relationship that didn't work out, a friendship that cooled without explanation, or a bond that broke when you most needed it to remain. Rejection hurts in a way going deep because it attacks identity, raises doubts about self-worth, and leaves a question spinning without answer. What's wrong with me? But this question starts from a premise spiritual discernment needs to urgently question, that all rejection is about you. Joseph was rejected by his own brothers, thrown into a pit, and sold as a slave. And each of these rejections seemed like the end of a story beginning with grand dreams. But looking from God's angle, each rejection was precise redirection toward the right place, at the right time, with the right people for purposes next phase. What brothers did with intention to destroy, God used with purpose to build, and the difference between the two results was in the perspective with which Joseph interpreted what happened after the process ended. Divine protection often looks like rejection because it removes you from environments, relationships, and paths seeming right, but God knew would be harmful to the purpose being developed. The relationship that didn't flow, the group that didn't accept you, the connection that didn't establish, these aren't always evidence of personal inadequacy. Sometimes they're doors God closed with other people's hands because there was something behind them you weren't equipped to see at the time, but the redirection spared you from facing. The practice of reframing rejection begins with a question completely changing internal conversation. Where is this rejection redirecting me? Instead of analyzing why you weren't accepted, start investigating what was opened in the space rejection created. Releasing rejection's narrative as failure and adopting redirection's narrative as protection is one of the most liberating movements existing. And it's a change requiring discernment and maturity only growing with time and with the Word. And speaking of signs God uses to redirect, there's a specific form of divine communication many people ignore because it appears repeated too much to seem like coincidence. There's a specific mercy in God's character manifesting in a way many people don't recognize as mercy until looking back, the mercy of repeated warnings. Before removing someone from your life or redirecting you from a path, God rarely acts without warning. He speaks through restlessness not passing, a dream not forgotten, a verse appearing 3 times in the same week, advice from a wise person saying exactly what you didn't want to hear. When the same sign appears from different sources and at different times, it's not coincidence. It's divine communication repeated for those who haven't yet acted on the first time. The red flag is perhaps the most ignored warning existing, not because people don't see it, but because affection, fear of loneliness, and cost of letting go create a very convincing set of arguments explaining why this time is different, why the situation will improve, and why it would be hasty to act based on something that can still change. But God doesn't place red flags by accident. They're active protection from one seeing the paths end when you're still at the beginning. And each time you ignore a red flag and continue, the next warning will need to be louder to be heard. Dreams are a language God used consistently throughout all of the Bible to communicate warnings, directions, and protections, and still uses today for those having sensitivity to receive them. Not every dream is divine revelation, but when a dream carries a clarity, an emotion, and a specificity differentiating it from common mental processing, discernment deserves taking it seriously in prayer. Likewise, advice from wise people knowing you, genuinely loving you, and having no personal interest in your decision is one of the most reliable confirmation forms God uses, especially when this advice says what you didn't want to hear. The practice of honoring God's repeated warnings begins with a decision to stop seeking confirmations for what you already want to do and start seeking clarity about what God is saying. Keep a prayer journal where you note warnings you notice, restlessness, significant dreams, advice received, repeating verses, and pray over the pattern emerging. When the same theme appears 3 or more times in different forms, treat this as priority message needing response, not endless analysis. And when you finally act in obedience to warning, something happens in relationships around revealing why God was insisting so much. There's a category of person not necessarily malicious, not necessarily toxic in the dramatic sense of the term, and not causing visible conflict in your life, but whose consistent presence creates a kind of invisible ceiling in your spiritual growth. While they're close, you can't advance to the next level, not from lack of effort, not from lack of faith, and not because of something you're doing wrong. It's like trying to climb stairs with weight tied to your ankle. You move, you try, but progress is disproportional to investment. Discernment needs to identify the weight before continuing to blame the stairs. The biblical pattern of separation for growth appears repeatedly. Abraham and Lot, Paul and Barnabas, Jesus and the crowds in recharging moments. In each case, separation wasn't motivated by rejection or by judgment, but by recognition different directions required different spaces. Abraham and Lot loved each other. Separation was proposed by Abraham with generosity, and it was exactly after it that God expanded Abraham's vision beyond what he could see when sharing the same space with someone having different objectives. Some separations aren't relationships end. They're redirection of two purposes needing distinct spaces to fully develop. The protection God exercises through relational obstacle removal isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's so gradual you only realize how much you were blocked when looking back and comparing growth that happened after separation with what was happening before it. Toxic relationships don't need to be violent or abusive to block growth. It's enough they consistently consume energy, attention, and focus the next level requires. And your purpose's next level has entry cost, including letting go of what's preventing the climb. The practice of evaluating whether someone is blocking your growth begins with honest comparison between two periods of your life, one with the person's presence and one without. Was there clearer spiritual growth in one than the other? Did your prayer become more alive, your focus sharper, or your calling clearer in a specific period? These answers aren't verdict. They're data for discernment to work with. And when you make the decision to let go of what's blocking growth, There's a specific experience God uses to confirm the decision was right, and it's perhaps the most comforting of all. There's a confirmation God uses with consistency bordering on poetic, and serving as one of the most reliable signs a removal was from Him and not just a hasty emotional decision. It's the peace that returns. Not the superficial peace of someone simply avoiding a difficult situation, not the temporary relief of someone fleeing conflict, but deep, stable, and growing peace settling in a way only explainable spiritually. When someone leaves your life and the first thing you feel, after the natural pain of loss, is a lightness you haven't felt in a long time, God is confirming that removal had His name. Philippians 4 verse 7 describes God's peace as something surpassing all understanding. And this description isn't just theological, it's experiential. This peace doesn't need logical explanation to exist, doesn't depend on all circumstances being resolved, and doesn't arrive accompanied by a list of reasons justifying its appearance. It's simply there, as evidence something in the spiritual environment around changed because what was disturbing was removed. Many people experience this peace after a separation and then start feeling guilty for not suffering anymore. But the peace you feel isn't insensitivity, it's confirmation. The redirection God promotes through removal always has dual purpose. It removes what was blocking you, but also creates space for what will arrive. The peace you feel after separation isn't just conflict's absence. It's presence of something new beginning to occupy the space that was opened. Healthier relationships, clearer focus, growth that was dammed up, blessings that were waiting for space to become available. All this begins moving when removal happens and peace confirms it was God acting. The practice of honoring the peace that returns begins with stopping interpreting absence of intense suffering as sign you didn't care enough. The peace God gives after necessary removal is a gift deserving to be received without guilt and without need to justify yourself to those not understanding the spiritual process that happened. Note in your prayer journal moments when you felt this peace return after difficult separation. These records will build a memory of God's faithfulness, sustaining your confidence next time He asks you to release something still hurting to release. We've reached the end of this message, but the truth is the most important work begins now. When you close this video and look with new eyes at relationships around. So before you go, let me ask you some questions deserving honest answer. Is there someone in your life whose presence consistently steals your peace, drains your energy, and distances you from God? And you already knew this, but didn't have courage to name it? Which blessings do you believe are dammed up in your life? And if you look honestly, is there a relationship occupying the space where these blessings should be arriving? And when you think about a separation that happened recently and still hurts, wasn't the peace that returned after it telling you something you're still resisting accepting? You learn God is not author of confusion, and constant absence of peace near a certain person may be divine removal sign, not your weakness. You learn God's relationships build and draw closer to Him, while toxic relationships drain and distance, and constant weight is spiritual data, not just emotional. You learned your spirit's restlessness near certain people may be the Holy Spirit exercising active protection, and this discernment deserves being trusted even without complete logical explanation. You learn when your prayer weakens and your focus is lost. It's time to look at who's occupying space that should be purposes. You learned rejection is redirection, and what seems like closed door may be divine protection from something behind it. You learn God gives repeated warnings and red flags. Dreams and wise counsel deserve being honored. You learn some people aren't toxic but block growth, and letting go is sometimes the most necessary act of obedience. And you learn the peace returning after removal is the most reliable confirmation God was acting. He removes to restore. Don't let this message be just another content you watched and stored in mental folder of things to think about later. Choose today a concrete action. pray asking discernment about relationships consuming without building. Note repeated warnings you've received and haven't yet acted on. Or simply decide you'll stop ignoring peace that disappears and lightness that returns as spiritual signs deserving to be taken seriously. If this message touched something you can't ignore, help me take it to more people. Subscribe to the channel, activate notification bells to not miss any content, and tell me here in comments what city you're watching this video from. I want to know where this word is reaching, because each person learning to discern what blocks their blessings and having courage to let go matters. May God give you discernment to identify what needs to be removed, courage to let go with love, and peace confirming it was Him acting in each necessary separation of your life.